Hello, everyone, and welcome to the colloquium on managing archaeological data in the digital age, best practices and realities. I thank you for your patience. We had some technical issues to work out because we're attempting to record this session so that we can make it available later via YouTube. And we'll be sending out that information if we manage to pull it off. My name is Deb Brown. I'm the librarian for Byzantine Studies at Dunbar and Oaks, and I have a background in Greek archaeology. And I'm very excited about the colloquium we're going to offer for you today. It is co-sponsored by the APA-affiliated group Forum for Classics, Libraries, and Scholarly Communications, and an AIA interest group for medieval and post-medieval archaeology. The purpose of this colloquium was to try and bring together archaeologists, librarians, museum professionals, IT professionals, archivists, and others who are interested in the issues of devising strategies for the collection, analysis, dissemination, and the long-term curation of these complex data sets we're creating in the field. And I think the papers that we offer today are a good overview, even though they're each focused on a specific project, about the issues that we face in each step of the process. I'm going to keep my introductory remarks short because we want to have as much time as possible for discussion, and we're hoping this will be the start of many more discussions. Our first paper is being delivered by William Caraher, who is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of North Dakota. I nearly said Carolina. North Dakota. He's also the co-director of the Pyla-Koutsopetria Archaeological Project in Cyprus. His paper is co-authored by his co-directors, David Pettegrew of Messiah College and Scott Moore of Indiana University of Pennsylvania, neither of whom could be here today. And the fourth author on the paper is Sam Fee, who is the associate professor in computing and information science at Washington Jefferson University, and we'll hear about Sam's contribution to the project, but he's not here today either. So, Bill.
This is the first paper I've given in like 15 years that I don't have the PowerPointer, so you're just gonna have to look at that slide. I guess if I'd been clever, I would have made a slide that just had the title. But and my paper, I think, is going to be somewhat different from the other papers. Maybe I'm apologizing too much, but it's going to be a bit of a group of notes that have sort of begun to coalesce around how our project in Cyprus dealt with the sort of changing digital landscape over the past decade and the sort of contingencies of both data collection, but also as we're looking ahead toward disseminating and archiving the data that our project created. And I attempt to kind of generalize from that, which, you know, as any typology in the archaeological world tends to be. It's an imperfect model, but hopefully it contributes something to the discussions that we have today, even if I'm not necessarily providing specific solutions. As typologies are prone to do, they create as many problems as solutions. In recent years, there's been a growing emphasis on the curation and preservation of digital data produced by archaeological projects across the Mediterranean and the world. The model projects in this process have traditionally been large, wealthy, and able to leverage considerable resources needed to digitize substantial bodies of archaeological data and to develop pioneering methods to collect and analyze data with digital tools. These projects have often created elaborate bespoke applications to collect, organize, and disseminate highly visible, long-term digital archives. The standards established by these projects over the past 25 years have exerted considerable influence over the conversations regarding data formats, legacy terminologies, and ontologies in archaeology. The results of efforts by projects like the American School of Classical Studies, excavations at the Athenian Agora, to name just a very well-known example, represents a significant example of how a large project can leverage their archival and archaeological material to produce an important digital collection. The Agora, with its sister site at Corinth, has the advantage of institutional and financial support, of course, of the American School of Classical Studies, under whose administrative structures both projects work. That such large projects, of course, can develop significant and substantial digital collections is hardly remarkable. The audience, resources, and institutional support will consistently produce results that are models for archaeologists working across the Mediterranean more broadly. This paper is not about the advantages possessed by a loosely defined group of large projects, as impressive and as important as they are. Our paper today, rather, will focus on smaller projects. This is in part because smaller projects face challenges that reveal the intersection of a common set of institutional and technological constraints. This paper uses the notion of a small project, in quotes, as a shorthand for projects that have limited infrastructure, small numbers of contributing scholars, typically finite lifespans, and typically small budgets for technology. As an archaeologist, we realize both the perils and utilities of building such typologies of small and large projects. But what we'll try to consider are projects with commitments to digital approaches, but which in general have to rely more on off-the-shelf software and have less access to the core infrastructure necessary to ensure the long-term preservation and accessibility of their data. In fact, these projects tend to function in a rather ad hoc or DIY ways and invest relatively little in the traditional or digital archaeological infrastructure. This is for small projects because they frequently privilege low-impact methods, which collect few finds, reveal only small parts of sites, and generally leave little in need of physical curation, conservation, or long-term storage. So there's a parallel, in fact, between what we do digitally and what we do sort of archaeologically. A small-scale survey project that surveys a couple square kilometers is going to be a very different beast than something like Nemea Valley Survey, which had vast quantities of data and vast quantities of physical material that require some term curation. To explore some of the issues facing smaller projects, we're going to use the Pyla-Koutsopetria Archaeological Project on Cyprus. PCAP is a 10-year-old project focused on a multi-period site on the south coast of Cyprus. The main focus of our work has been on an intensive pedestrian survey conducted between 2004 and 2009, and 3 seasons of small-scale excavation in 2009, 10, and 12, interspersed with several study seasons. The basic data from the survey and excavations were collected on paper forms. These forms were then keyed into a relational database using Microsoft Access. Spatial data from the survey and excavation were stored and analyzed in Esri's ArcGIS. Paper forms were scanned into Adobe PDF format, and images were generally produced and archived in either TIFF or JPEG. Until recently, we have maintained our data in such commercial proprietary software formats, and as a result, we will require significant post-processing to produce collections that conform to archival standards. These are standard concerns. As a small project seeking to streamline data collection and analysis, we found ourselves privileging immediate utility over commitments to platform-agnostic best practices. By using Microsoft Access and Esri software, we limited our users to Microsoft-based computers. Moreover, we did very little to optimize data recording for multiple users or for future online dissemination and publication. As a result, we created a data entry bottleneck at the point where we converted the archaeological information collected in the field into digital data for analysis. The same discussion was being bandied about in the geospatial workshop yesterday, where there tends to be a single GIS person who has the GISs on their computer, and everything sort of comes and goes out of that particular vortex. So it creates these sort of social, these kind of institutional forms of organization on small projects. It's important to emphasize that this was not necessarily exclusively a function of selecting programs incompatible with simultaneous multi-user data entry functions, but rather we lacked the technical expertise and the server-side support to make these programs work in the most efficient way possible. Off-the-shelf components for data collection and analysis were not necessarily a bad choice, but they do structure the way in which archaeological information is collected and disseminated. The utility of Access and ArcGIS drives from their ubiquitous distribution, functionality, and relatively short learning curve. At the same time, both programs privilege a single user interface that structures the practice of data collection and analysis. While data collection in the field, either a survey or excavation form, remains a dispersed endeavor, including the entire field team or trench, the absence of server-side and development support for a customized version of standard software led data entry to fall to a single person. As a result, archaeological information moved from the collective responsibilities of a project to the unique responsibility of a single data curator, who also came to have significant influence over data structuring and interpretation. At the point of digitization, the data curator normalized irregularities, for example, possible on a paper form, to allow them to conform to the standards enforced through fields in a digital database. This process occurred away from the field and the field teams. And acknowledging this, we preserve the paper forms to maintain a degree of transparency. But again, this is a very typical procedure on a small or mid-sized project where one person is keying the data there's a transition from paper forms to digital data structure that is beginning to be overcome as more sophisticated digital tools are becoming available, but these, as we'll see, have certain risks and liabilities. Well, most of our data collection relied upon off-the-shelf software. In 2012, with the assistance of Sam Fee from Washington and Jefferson College in Pennsylvania, and with the support of Messiah College, we beta tested. Beta is pretty optimistic. We alpha tested, let's say, a bespoke web application that made it possible to collect data traditionally recorded on paper forms directly into an iPad. Because we were still fine-tuning this customized app at the start of the season, we decided to use iPads as an experiment in data collection that replicated, in effect, paper forms. The adoption of the iPad actually divided the data collection from the field into two parts, with students taking turns recording data on the iPad and trench supervisors making an official record of excavation on paper SU forms, stratigraphic unit forms. The resulting data collected on iPads was deposited nightly in a Gmail account, and this provided us with a data set that we will, and we're just beginning to do this now, compare with the more authoritative narrative produced on paper by the trench supervisor. The adoption, of course, of a portable tool for digital data recording moved us one step closer to converging the embodied process of creating archaeological data with the creation of a digital record for analysis. So we're streamlining this. The collaboration with an app developer, Sam Fee, however, was simply luck. We just happened to luck into knowing this guy who could do this for us, and represents an exception to our typical reliance on off-the-shelf software. We are, of course, aware that producing archaeological data in any form requires not just the tools, but also a careful attention to metadata that describe the nature and structure of the information. Producing good metadata in the context of a small project can be a distinct challenge. Small projects often have highly specialized or limited research agendas and limited resources that call for the careful balancing of efficiency of data collection against the responsibilities for best practices and the opportunities for the data produced to contribute to future or large-scale research questions that extend beyond the life and scope of the project. Traditionally, large projects have exerted a substantial influence over best practices and quite naturally set the terms for how information collected by small projects can contribute to a significant archaeological question. In short, small projects that produce data comparable with large bodies of archaeological information add value to their data set and extend the significance of the project beyond the limited research questions, often at the core of smaller projects' research. Moreover, adopting the processes, terminologies, and technologies developed by large projects spares small projects the time and energy to develop these key aspects for themselves. Our work at Pyla-Koutsopetria addressed a rather limited set of research questions, and the project lacked any obvious and practical obligations to pre-existing data conventions. In other words, we weren't beholden to any earlier field work in the area. When we started our work there, it was the first project really to work in a modern way at the site. To avoid producing an insular data set, however, we adopted a vocabulary to describe our material and procedures that was consistent with larger projects. We adapted our excavation techniques and our survey forms from larger existing projects as well, namely the Corinth excavations in Greece, who provided us with a template for excavations, and the Eastern Corinthia Archaeological Survey, who provided us with a template for recording field data and survey. While our adaptation of these projects' templates for data collection saved us significant time and helped us to avoid reinventing the wheel. In the realm of digital data, sharing structures and even ontologies posed some risks and challenges. For example, we described our finds using the chronotype system, which is a system of terminology pioneered by the Eastern Corinthia Archaeological Survey in Greece and the Sydney-Cyprus Survey Project on Cyprus, and adapted most recently for the use in the Troodos Environmental and Archaeological Survey Project. We have since exported this chronotype system to other fieldwork, including the way that a team of us have been documenting the finds from the Princeton Polis expedition at Pyla-Koutsopetria on the western part of the island, and even parts of the Athienu project, which is immediately north of our site. While each of these projects prepared their data sets using unique methods and sampling strategies, the common naming system of finds has made it easier for us to compare the presence of artifact types between them
and when sampling strategies and environmental conditions allow, to compare assemblages. Recent efforts to compare excavation and survey datasets side by side, however, have exposed the limits of such cross-project data consistency and comparability exercises. The central issues remain: how much emphasis should we place on creating and exploiting seemingly comparative datasets, or whether greater harm comes from denaturing archaeological results in the name of an illusory homogeneity? If comparative approaches are fraught with potential methodological and interpretive issues, then we should be equally hesitant to generalize our data structures, terminology or practices in the name of efficiency alone. These remain, of course, challenging and open questions that affect small projects in a very particular way. Despite certain open questions, adopting standardized data structures and terminology nevertheless appeals to small projects, with the advantage of improving the usefulness of data for comparative study, or for facilitating the aggregation of data for larger discussions of regional or transregional trends. These advantages, however, extend to more than just the perceived utility of comparable data for analysis, but also to the long-term preservation of the growing body of born digital and digitized information. Scholars have long been aware that archaeological information with broad utility is more likely to be distributed widely, shared, and as a result preserved. For digital data, utility is all the more significant. As scholars use digital data, it gets duplicated and preserved as multiple copies, and the more the community finds utility in data sets, the more they are likely to share the investment in its preservation. These practices are particularly significant for smaller projects, like PCAP, which lacks the resources to invest in long-term in-house data archiving. For projects with limited resources, the key concerns are the ease in data transfer, long-term data integrity, and the visibility of our data to our specialized archaeological community. While I've not solved all of our archiving problems, there's little doubt that a small project like ours must share our data and embrace a model of distributed storage. Despite the myriad options available, it remains less clear how to achieve the kind of visibility and accessibility necessary to achieve these goals, while preserving the distinct and unique nature of our project's information. Small projects have limited resources and distinct forms of organization. These two limitations shape the way in which projects adopt and implement technology and structure their data. Recent scholarship has become increasingly attuned to how archaeological projects produce knowledge. Photography, modern survey tools, computers, relational databases, GIS applications, and global connectivity have all shaped our expectations for how we analyze, publish, and preserve data collected from the field. While we admit that our case study is idiosyncratic, it nevertheless represents some of the ways in which small projects rely on off-the-shelf components that shape the data collection and analysis process. The limited and distinct character of many small project datasets has influenced the structure of small project data. The way in which archaeological knowledge is structured in digital environments impacts the immediate and potential utility of small project data, and this in turn has implications for the long-term preservation of this material. The deeply interconnected nature of data collection, data utility, and preservation highlights the social character of archaeological knowledge and reminds us that the tools we use and how we use them shape the knowledge that we produce. Thanks.
We have 5 minutes to allow for questions from the audience.
That was a really good paper and a really good summary of stuff, and I'm glad to have heard it because it feeds right into what I'm going to say. So thank you for that contribution. I'm really curious about the your testing of the mobile technologies. And in particular, I'm curious about what I'm hoping somebody would do, which is a controlled experiment about the difference between paper recording and tablet recording. And so I wonder if you have any plans. Right now you have a system in which the students who don't know what they're doing are using the tablets, and the supervisors who do are doing the paper documentation. Do you have any plans to do a blind control where you have people who know what they're doing using the tablets and people who know what they're doing using the paper system?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is, of course, I actually think maybe what we're going to interrogate in this data is actually even slightly, at least to my mind, cooler than that, which is the sense that both of these things are being produced as a product of the same process. In fact, the students who may or may not know what they're doing are actually just
just using the device. That they like, you know, touching the screen. It's like the little video of the cat playing with it, right? I mean, the students were very familiar and comfortable with it and interested in it. And so they were actually reporting data that is being produced information rather, it's being produced in fundamentally the same way as the trench supervisor was on our data recording form. In other words, through conversations in the trench, through jumping down in the trench and scraping around, through, you know, getting, you know, the student to use the Munsell book and then checking their Munsell readings. So these are actually being produced in fundamentally coming off the edge of the trowel in the same way. However, it's the translation then of that data or that information in two different forms that should be interesting for us. In other words, what constraints do you begin to have by using an iPad at the edge of the trench? In other words, iPads have, the way we've organized our database there, it's going to normalize the data much closer to the edge of the trowel than our paper forms. Our paper forms really quite regularly get subverted in various ways. And actually that's often something that then has to be normalized, you know, in the lab or back at home or whatever. And so I think one of the things we're going to be interested in is comparing these two data sets, as it were, one coming off the paper form, one coming off the iPad, and understanding better how these technologies are kind of creating the kind of data that we're producing, the type of knowledge we're producing.
If you can, I would definitely also try to get the same people doing both, though, because I think there's been a fair amount of work done in the last few years about the cognitive differences in handwriting versus typing.
Sure.
So you're doing different things in your brain.
Yep.
And I'd be really interested to see a systematic study of the difference that the same person is showing in recording between a tablet and a paper sheet, so that we know if we move that way what we're losing or gaining.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be super cool. Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little more on the specifics of the data you're collecting in the field? So for each, whatever, collection unit, stratigraphic unit, whatever you call it, so you have certain fields, and then you said you were trying to like make it work with other projects. So did you actually sit down with people with other projects to make sure that your fields were comparable to the fields like elevation, you know, whatever?
Yeah, I mean, one thing with excavation is that I think if we got, you know, if we pulled every excavator at the conference together, they would all more or less agree on basic elements of the data structure. And in fact, many of our trench supervisors and actually my co-director and various other people all excavated at Corinth, as, you know, whatever, seemingly like 50% of the people working in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean have. And so they were able to sort of implement, in effect, a system that's very, very similar. Now, whether this is reflected in the formal structure of our data or not, I mean, it's a little bit harder to say, only because I don't remember us looking at Corinth's excavation database. But I think because the methods are similar, the data is going to be fundamentally similar. We use, for example, a modified version of their field manual. And so we're in basic ways collecting the same thing. Now, whether we have to change what a particular field is called, yeah, I mean, that type of thing. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes.
But.
And then you also have them writing a standard kind of journal diary
Yep.
narrative. Okay.
Yeah, and then so we have basically a paper form that on the front of it is a bunch of almost, you know, check boxes and fill in the blanks, as it were, Munsell color or whatever. And then we have a bunch of lined forms that basically can be used to do the standard narrative description. And this is, of course, one of the interesting things about the difference between paper and digital techniques is that, you know, we were pretty rigorous in saying, you know, everything goes on these forms. If you screw up, draw a line through it. If you need a piece of scrap paper, you know, do it in the margins or whatever. But with an iPad, of course, if you screw up, you just delete it, and it's gone. You know, it may not be gone forever. We know everything lasts forever on the interwebs, but it's, you know, it is in practical ways invisible. It is gone, and so that's something that we couldn't replicate when we moved to a more digital format.
And but the students were also writing a narrative on iPad.
We still have time for questions. Yes.
It seems to me there's a real danger of sunk capital here. And the way you describe things, it looks to me like it's also like early Christianity. Everybody's going off in their own direction. How do you foresee this developing in the future? Is there going to be a grand congress to give us a New Testament? or are we just going to have survival of the fittest?
Well, I mean, this is the interesting thing, right? I mean, as we know, what happened in early Christianity wasn't so much that everyone came together and agreed. It was like a bunch of people agreed, and then everyone else got stomped on, basically. I mean, basically got pushed further and further to the margins until their data formats became, irrelevant. And I've at least kind of subtly suggested that in some ways, big projects have done that. And we can hope that the early churches behave in responsible ways, and that we form bridges and communicate effectively, that maybe they allow some of the Gnostics to at least hang out around the edges of the church or whatever. But then there's another reality that kind of got truncated out of this paper, which is, I think in some ways the future of Mediterranean archaeology is going to be smaller projects. Like I suspect, at least in my experiences in Greece, at least, the big major excavations of Athens and Corinth, of course, they're going to persist into the future, but the big, large-scale surveys that were being conducted 15, 20 years ago that were exerting massive influences on the way in which survey data structures, survey forms, survey methods were being imagined and used, I'm not sure we're going to see another generation of that any time soon. So as we have these smaller and smaller projects that are proliferating with more and more focused research questions, because we're no longer studying, for example, it becomes hard to even get a permit to study a genuine region. So your research question becomes more narrow, your data collection strategies become more narrow, your metadata becomes more complex as you attempt to describe what methods you use to develop the data that you collected in the field. And then how is this going to change the way in which this future Congress, where all the branches of Christianity sit down and try to find ways to interlink their data functions? Maybe Sebastian has an answer, actually.
It's not so much that I have an answer, but yes, I'm happy to continue the Christian analogy of, be in the Eastern Mediterranean and be Eastern Orthodox and say that, no bishop can tell another bishop that they're absolutely wrong, and that we look to, align differences in Christology between Miaphysite and Diophysite Christology, but agree that we're all talking about the same thing, so we can sit down and decide that we are all Christian, then we all have to be Christian. So I'll stop that. But yes, I don't think it's especially if you're talking about a more fragmented, smaller project world. As one looks more closely at one's region, one can end up deciding that one needs one's own unique vocabulary to do that. And it is not possible to tell people that that's not right. If they need a vocabulary to describe the phenomenon they're seeing, that is okay. It is how do you then turn that around and present that on the public internet in such a way that people can discover the commonalities between the data before diving into the differences. So I think that you started to indicate towards that, but where is the vocabulary that allows us all to just find out what we are all talking about, and then still leave the opportunity for diversity, and ultimately I think even up to us as people to decide what we're interested in, rather than outsourcing to the computers, hit return and find an answer. We're always going to have to be diving into our data, so it is okay that there's some variability, but it's the balance between standardization and variability that I think you're moving towards with the chronotype system, but I hope you're not ironing out the diversity between the projects that you're seeing. So I don't know that pushed forward on what Bill said, but we are going to be in a constant conversation between standardization and variability, and we don't want to lose either. We do not want to lose either.
Right, and I think the one point, at least I tried to make, just to kind of follow that up, is that the one risk that small projects have is that if we become too idiosyncratic, it doesn't mean that someone can't go and dig into our notebooks and figure out what the hell we did. I mean, we're all good archaeologists. We record our methods and our techniques, in a robust way. But the more idiosyncratic our data set is, then the harder it is to discuss integration with larger bodies of knowledge. And the risk is, if it is just what is it, a white elephant, a pink elephant, whatever type of elephant it is, it may not be preserved, because the use is the method for preservation. That I think the future is going to be distributed. It's going to be distributed archiving. It's not going to be some big data vault like at the end of Indiana Jones. It's going to be
everyone having this thing in the cloud, everyone downloading it, the more copies that are around, the more likely it is to be the same way that our libraries function today. And so, I mean, I think that's the hard thing to negotiate as a small project. The more I make my data look like a large project's data, the more it fits into an ongoing conversation, and the more likely it is then to be preserved as that conversation continues. The more I do kind of idiosyncratic research, and I describe these unique and discrete phenomena, the greater risk there is, unless I'm just friggin' brilliant, for this stuff to be left to the wayside because it can't fit into this conversation any longer. And once, with digital data, the expiration dates are all the closer.
All right, thank you, Bill. And that leads very well into our second paper of the morning, which is, oh, okay.